For more than 1,000 years, one empire stood as the last living echo of ancient Rome. While the western half of the Roman world crumbled into ruins, while barbarian kingdoms rose and fell across Europe, while entire civilizations came and went, one city on the edge of two continents held the line. Constantinople, the queen of cities. The empire we now call Byzantium, though the people who lived there never used that name. They called themselves Romans right up until the very end, because in their minds, they were Rome, the unbroken continuation of the empire of Augustus and Constantine, sanctified by God, defended by the greatest walls ever built, ruled by emperors who believed they were God's chosen regents on earth. At its height, the Byzantine Empire stretched across the eastern Mediterranean, from the deserts of Syria to the coasts of Italy, from the Balkans to North Africa. It preserved the knowledge of the ancient world when the rest of Europe had forgotten how to read Greek. It produced Justinian, who reconquered half the old empire and built the Hagia Sophia, a dome so vast that visitors believed it was suspended from heaven by a golden chain. Its gold coin, the solidus, was the trusted currency of the medieval world for 700 years. Its diplomats, its scholars, its theologians shaped the destiny of the entire eastern half of Christendom. For over a millennium, Constantinople was the richest, most sophisticated, most heavily defended city on earth. And then, on a single spring morning in 1453, it was gone. Not slowly, not gently. The last emperor died sword in hand on the walls of his own capital, his body never found, swallowed by the chaos of the massacre that followed. And his family, the Palaeologos dynasty, the last royal house of Rome, was scattered to the winds. Some fled to the courts of Italy and became beggars in silk, pensioners of popes, selling a crown they no longer possessed. Some bent the knee to the very conqueror who had destroyed them, taking his gold and, in some cases, his religion. One young woman traveled 2,000 miles north into the frozen forests of Russia and planted a seed that would grow into an entirely new empire. And a few simply vanished into history, their bloodlines dissolving into the ordinary populations of a dozen nations. This is the story of what happened to the imperial family of Byzantium after their 1,000-year empire finally fell. And it is stranger, sadder, and more consequential than almost anyone realizes. Because the fall of Constantinople did not just end an empire. It scattered a dynasty whose ghost would haunt the thrones of Europe for centuries to come. To understand the fall, you first need to understand just how far this empire had already declined. Because by 1453, Byzantium was a shadow of a shadow. The empire that Justinian had ruled in the 6th century was a Mediterranean superpower governing 30 million people across 3 continents. The empire that Constantine XI inherited in the 15th century was, in reality, little more than the city of Constantinople itself, plus a few scattered territories in Greece. The treasury was empty. The population of the city had fallen from perhaps 500,000 at its peak to around 50,000. Entire neighborhoods within the ancient walls had become farmland. The wound that never healed came in 1204, when an army of Western European crusaders, who were supposed to be marching to the Holy Land, turned on Constantinople itself. They besieged it, stormed it, and sacked it with a savagery that shocked even the medieval world. For 3 days they looted the greatest city in Christendom, stripping churches of their gold, smashing ancient statues, desecrating the Hagia Sophia. The Byzantine Empire was carved into pieces and handed to Western nobles. The Greeks eventually retook their capital in 1261, but the empire never recovered. The damage was too deep. From that point on, Byzantium was a dying state, surviving on diplomacy, on tribute, on playing its enemies against one another, and on the sheer stubborn strength of its ancient walls. Meanwhile, a new power was rising in the east, the Ottoman Turks. Generation by generation, the Ottomans swallowed Byzantine territory. They crossed into Europe. They conquered the Balkans. By the early 1400s, Constantinople was an island of Roman Christianity surrounded on every side by a vast and growing Muslim empire. The emperors traveled to Western Europe, humbling themselves before popes and kings, begging for military aid to save their city. They even agreed, at enormous cost to their own people's faith, to submit the Orthodox Church to the authority of Rome, hoping this would buy them a crusade. It bought them almost nothing. The West sent words and prayers. It did not send armies. Then came the young man who would finish it all off. Mehmed II, the Ottoman Sultan, ascended the throne determined to take the city that had resisted his ancestors for 1,000 years. He was 21 years old, brilliant, ruthless, and utterly obsessed with Constantinople. He built massive fortresses on the Bosphorus, cutting the city off from the Black Sea. He assembled an army of somewhere between 50 and 80,000 men. And he commissioned the largest cannons the world had ever seen, monstrous bronze guns capable of hurling stone balls weighing over half a ton against walls that had never been breached in 1,000 years of sieges. Inside the city, the last emperor prepared to die. Constantine XI. Palaiologos was in many ways the perfect man to be the final Roman emperor. He was brave, dignified, and deeply committed to his people. He had spent years as the despot of the Morea, the Byzantine territory in southern Greece, where he had actually enjoyed some military success. When he became emperor in 1449, he inherited a hopeless situation and faced it with extraordinary courage. He could muster perhaps 7,000 defenders, including a few thousand foreign volunteers, mostly Italians, to hold nearly 14 miles of walls against a force 10 times their size. He refused every offer to surrender. When Mehmed offered to spare his life if he handed over the city, Constantine reportedly replied that to give up Constantinople was not his right, nor anyone's, and that his people would rather die than surrender it. The siege lasted 53 days. The great cannons pounded the walls relentlessly, and each night the exhausted defenders repaired the damage by torchlight. The Ottomans attacked again and again and were thrown back again and again. But the defenders were bleeding away, and there were no reinforcements coming. In the early hours of May 29, 1453, Mehmed launched his final assault. Through a combination of overwhelming numbers and a small gate that had been left carelessly unlocked, the Ottomans broke through. The defense collapsed. What happened to Constantine XI in those final moments has become one of the great mysteries of history. The most enduring account says that when the emperor saw the city was lost, he tore off his imperial regalia so that he would die as an ordinary soldier rather than be captured as a trophy. He drew his sword, charged into the oncoming Ottoman troops, and was cut down in the chaos. His body was never definitively identified. Some accounts claim his head was brought to Mehmed. Others say he was buried in an unmarked grave. The truth is, nobody knows where the last emperor of Rome lies. He simply vanished into the fall of his own city, becoming a legend in the very moment of his death. And here is a detail that would echo for centuries. Because his body was never found, a legend was born among the Greek people. They said an angel had turned Constantine to marble and hidden him in a cave beneath the city, and that one day he would awaken, the marble emperor, and reclaim Constantinople for the Greeks. For hundreds of years under Ottoman rule, this legend gave hope to a conquered people. The last emperor became immortal precisely because no one could prove he was dead. Constantine XI had no children and no direct heirs. He died a widower on the walls, which meant the survival of the imperial dynasty now rested on his brothers and on what remained of the family scattered across Greece and beyond. Constantine had two brothers who mattered most in what came next, Thomas Palaiologos and Demetrios Palaiologos. In the years before the fall, these two had jointly ruled the Morea, the Byzantine enclave in southern Greece, the last significant territory the empire still held outside the capital. And these two brothers could not have been more different or gotten along more poorly. Demetrios was the pragmatist, the schemer who believed accommodation with the Ottomans was the only realistic path forward. Thomas leaned toward the West, toward Rome and Italy and the Catholic world, hoping that Latin Christendom might yet come to the rescue of the Greeks. The two brothers spent the years after Constantinople's fall, not uniting against the common enemy, but feuding with each other, even fighting a small civil war between themselves while the Ottoman noose tightened around their little realm. It could not last. In 1460, just 7 years after Constantinople fell, Mehmed II turned his attention to the Morea and swept through it with overwhelming force. The last Byzantine territory in Greece was conquered in a matter of months. And now the two brothers faced their moment of decision, and they chose opposite paths. Demetrios surrendered. He threw himself on the Sultan's mercy, handing over his lands and, in a gesture that must have been agonizing, giving his daughter Helena to Mehmed's harem. In exchange, Mehmed granted Demetrios a comfortable pension and estates near Constantinople. For a time, the former despot of the Morea lived as a wealthy dependent of the man who had destroyed his family's empire. But it did not end well. Demetrios eventually fell out of favor. His revenues were stripped away. He ended his days as a monk, having taken the monastic name David, dying in poverty in 1470. His daughter, the one given to the Sultan, died alone and unmarried some years later. The Ottoman branch of the imperial family had bought a few years of comfort and then faded into nothing. Thomas chose exile. When the Morea fell, Thomas gathered his family and fled by sea to the Venetian-controlled island of Corfu, and then onward to Rome, the seat of the Pope. And Thomas did not arrive empty-handed. He carried with him the skull of St. Andrew the Apostle, one of the most precious relics in all of Christendom, which had been kept in the Greek city of Patras. He presented this sacred treasure to Pope Pius II as a gift, and in doing so, he secured his welcome. The Pope received Thomas with genuine honor. Here, after all, was the brother of the last Christian emperor of the East, a living symbol of the tragedy that had befallen Christendom. The Pope granted Thomas a generous pension, and other Western rulers contributed as well, treating him as a distinguished royal refugee. For a few years, Thomas Palaiologos lived in Rome as an honored guest, the exiled heir of a fallen empire, always hoping, always petitioning, always dreaming that the West would finally launch a great crusade to restore the Greeks to their homeland. That crusade never came. Thomas died in Rome in 1465, 12 years after the fall, having never seen his homeland again. He passed his hollow imperial title and his family's fading fortunes to his 3 surviving children, 2 sons, Andreas and Manuel, and a daughter named Zoe. Each of them would take a radically different road, and between the 3 of them, they tell the whole story of what happened to the last Roman dynasty. One would squander everything in the courts of Western Europe. One would walk back into the arms of the conqueror, and one would found an empire that would outlast them all. Andreas Palaiologos, the elder son, inherited the title that everyone recognized but no one could redeem, Emperor of Constantinople. He was, in the eyes of the Catholic world, the legitimate heir to the throne of the Caesars, and he spent his entire adult life trying to turn that empty title into something real and failing, and slowly sinking into poverty and desperation. The Pope continued his pension as had been paid to his father, but it was never enough. Andreas lived in Rome with expensive tastes and an inflated sense of his own importance, styling himself emperor and appointing officials to a court that governed nothing. His pension was cut, his debts mounted, and so Andreas hit upon a scheme that was either ingenious or desperate, depending on how you look at it. He decided to sell his empire. Since he was the rightful heir to the Byzantine throne, he reasoned, he owned the rights to that throne, and rights could be sold. In 1494, Andreas Palaiologos signed a document transferring his claim to the imperial crown of Constantinople to King Charles VIII of France in exchange for money. Later, when that arrangement produced little, he sold the same rights again, this time to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the very monarchs who had just sponsored Christopher Columbus on his voyage to the Americas. Think about that for a moment. The heir to the 1,000-year Roman Empire, the descendant of Constantine and Justinian, reduced to peddling his imperial birthright to whichever European king would pay, like a man pawning the last heirloom of a great house. And still, it was not enough. Andreas Palaiologos died in Rome in 1502, so poor that he left barely enough money to cover his own funeral. The man who called himself Emperor of the Romans died a pauper in a foreign city. His imperial claims scattered among the royal houses of France and Spain, who would occasionally, over the following centuries, list Constantinople among their many empty titles. His brother Manuel took a very different road. Manuel found the poverty and dependence of Rome intolerable, and he made a decision that would have horrified his father. He went back. He traveled to Constantinople and threw himself on the mercy of Sultan Mehmed II, and remarkably, Mehmed received him generously, granting the Byzantine prince a pension and estates. Manuel lived out his days in the former imperial capital, now the Ottoman capital, under the protection of his family's destroyer. His sons, the grandsons of a Byzantine despot, grew up in that world and converted to Islam. The male line of the Palaiologos dynasty, in Constantinople at least, quietly dissolved into the empire that had replaced it. Within 2 generations, the direct male line of the Byzantine emperors had come to almost nothing. One brother's sons became Muslim Ottoman subjects. The other brother died a bankrupt in Rome, having sold a crown he could not wear. It seemed the imperial house of Byzantium was simply fading into oblivion, a footnote in the margins of history. But there was that daughter, and through her, everything changed. Zoe Palaiologina had been raised in Rome after her family's flight from Greece, brought up under papal care and educated as a Catholic. She was, by all accounts, intelligent and formidable, and she carried in her veins the blood of the Roman emperors. To the men who arranged marriages in that era, she was an extraordinarily valuable piece on the diplomatic chessboard, a living link to the imperial legacy of Constantinople. And the Pope had a very specific idea about where to place her. Far to the north, in the rising Principality of Moscow, sat a ruler named Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, a widower who was in the process of gathering the scattered Russian lands under his authority and building what would become the Russian state. The papacy, always hoping to draw the Orthodox Russians toward Rome, saw a marriage between this powerful northern prince and the Byzantine princess as a masterstroke of diplomacy. In 1472, Zoe traveled from Rome across the whole of Europe to Moscow. Upon arriving in Orthodox Russia, she shed her Latin upbringing, embraced the Orthodox faith of her ancestors, and took the name by which history would remember her, Sophia. She married Ivan III and became the Grand Princess of Moscow. The papacy's dream of pulling Russia toward Rome came to nothing, but what Sophia brought north with her would prove far more lasting than any church union. She brought the idea of empire. Sophia arrived in Moscow steeped in the ceremony, the majesty, and the imperial ideology of Constantinople, and she is widely credited with transforming the rough court of Moscow into something grander, something that consciously imitated the vanished splendor of Byzantium. Under her influence, Moscow began to claim a breathtaking inheritance. If Constantinople had been the second Rome, the heir to the imperial and Christian legacy of the original Rome, then Moscow, now joined by marriage to the last Byzantine dynasty and the last major independent Orthodox power on earth, would become the third Rome. A monk named Philotheus put it in words that became doctrine. 2 Romes had fallen, a third stood, and a fourth there would never be. The symbols followed the ideology. The double-headed eagle, the emblem of the Byzantine emperors, was adopted as the emblem of the Russian state, and it would remain the symbol of Russia for centuries, all the way through the Romanovs and beyond. The very title of the Russian rulers, Tsar, is simply the Slavic form of the Latin word Caesar, the ancient title of the Roman emperors. Through Sophia Palaiologina, the granddaughter of a Byzantine emperor's brother, the imperial idea of Rome did not die in 1453. It migrated north and was reborn on the plains of Russia. Sophia and Ivan's grandson was Ivan IV, the ruler history remembers as Ivan the Terrible, who in 1547 formally took the title of Tsar, the first Russian ruler to be crowned as such. The blood of the Palaiologos, the last dynasty of Byzantium, ran in the veins of the man who founded the Russian Tsardom. And so, the most enduring legacy of the fallen imperial family was not a restored Greek empire, not a reconquered Constantinople, but an entirely new empire in the north that would grow into one of the great powers of the world, carrying the eagle and the title of the Caesars into the modern age. But the Palaiologos of Constantinople were not the only Byzantine imperial family swept away in the 15th century. There was another empire, a smaller one, clinging to the far shore of the Black Sea, and its ruling family met an even darker fate. When the Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, a branch of the earlier Komnenos dynasty had fled east and established their own small state centered on the city of Trebizond. The Empire of Trebizond, as it grandly styled itself, was tiny but wealthy, sitting astride lucrative trade routes between east and west. It actually outlasted Constantinople itself. When the great city fell in 1453, Trebizond held on for another 8 years, the last independent fragment of the Byzantine world. But Mehmed II was not a man to leave loose ends. In 1461, his armies and his fleet closed in on Trebizond. And the last emperor, David Komnenos, seeing that resistance was hopeless, surrendered the city in exchange for promises of safety for himself and his family. Mehmed relocated David and his relatives to the Ottoman heartland and granted them estates. For 2 years they lived as pensioners of the Sultan, and then it went terribly wrong. In 1463, Mehmed grew suspicious, or perhaps simply decided that living members of a rival imperial house were a danger he no longer wished to tolerate. David Komnenos, the last emperor of Trebizond, was ordered executed along with 7 of his sons and a nephew. When they were led out to die, David was told his life would be spared if he converted to Islam, and he refused. The bodies were reportedly left unburied as a warning. The Komnenos dynasty of Trebizond, which had reigned for over 250 years, was extinguished in an afternoon of executions. So when we ask what happened to the Byzantine royal families, this is part of the answer too. Some of them were simply killed, wiped out entirely to remove any rallying point for the conquered subjects of the new empire. Yet the Palaiologos name did not entirely vanish from the earth. Threads of it survived in the most unexpected places. Long before the fall, a branch of the family had settled in northern Italy, in the Marquisate of Monferrato, when a Palaiologos prince inherited that Italian territory through marriage in the 14th century. This Italian line ruled Monferrato as a noble house for nearly 200 years, right through the fall of Constantinople and beyond, until the male line finally died out in the 16th century. For generations, Palaiologos rulers governed a small Italian state while their imperial cousins in the east were being destroyed, a strange parallel existence that most people have never heard of. And beyond even that, the name scattered into the general population. Refugees who fled the fall of Constantinople carried their bloodlines into Greece, Italy, and the wider Mediterranean. Over the centuries, families claiming descent from the Palaiologos, the Komnenos, and other great Byzantine houses appeared across many countries. There is even a much-debated tradition that a branch of the Palaiologos family ended up in Cornwall in England, where a 17th-century tombstone in a small parish church marks the grave of a man who claimed descent from the imperial line. Whether genuine or romantic invention, historians still argue. But it captures something true about this story: how far and how thinly the blood of the last Roman emperors spread across the world after their empire died. Now let me put all of this in a broader context, because the fall of the Byzantine imperial family was not just a dynastic tragedy. It was one of the great turning points in world history, and its consequences still shape our world today. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is often cited as the event that marks the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. When the great city fell, Greek scholars fled westward carrying precious manuscripts, the accumulated knowledge of the ancient world, pouring into Italy at the very moment the Renaissance was catching fire. The rediscovery of classical Greek learning, which fueled the intellectual explosion of the Renaissance, was accelerated enormously by these refugees from the dying empire. In a strange and beautiful irony, the death of Byzantium helped give birth to the modern Western mind. The fall also permanently reshaped the map of religion and power. With Constantinople in Ottoman hands, the center of gravity of the Orthodox Christian world shifted decisively toward Russia, which would spend centuries seeing itself as the divinely appointed protector of orthodoxy and the true heir to the Roman and Byzantine legacy. That self-image, that sense of a sacred imperial mission inherited from the Palaiologos dynasty, would influence Russian identity and Russian ambitions in ways that echo even now. And there is something deeply human about this story that transcends the politics and the battles. It is a story about what happens when a family that once believed itself chosen by God to rule the earth suddenly finds itself with nothing. A prince selling his crown to pay his debts, a princess crossing a continent to plant her family's legacy in frozen foreign soil. Brothers choosing opposite paths in the same catastrophe, one bending to the conqueror and one fleeing to strangers, and both losing everything in the end anyway. A dynasty that ruled the last remnant of Rome and then simply melted away into the ordinary flow of human life, leaving behind names on tombstones and eagles on flags, and a legend of a sleeping emperor beneath a ruined city. Because when you really think about it, the Byzantines experienced a fall unlike almost any other royal family in history. The Romanovs were murdered in a single night, but their empire had existed for only 3 centuries. The Ottomans were exiled and impoverished, but their story played out in the full glare of the 20th century, documented and remembered. The Byzantine imperial family fell at the very hinge between the medieval and modern worlds, and their fall was so total, so scattered, so slow to complete, that most people today do not even realize they had descendants at all. The last dynasty of the Roman Empire did not go out with a single dramatic act. It dissolved across 5 centuries and a dozen nations until the blood of the Caesars was flowing, unrecognized, through the veins of ordinary people who have no idea they carry it. And yet the idea of Byzantium, the eagle, the title of Caesar, the dream of the Third Rome, the memory of the greatest city of the medieval world, proved far more durable than the family that once embodied it. Empires die, dynasties scatter, but ideas, it turns out, can outlive the bloodlines that carried them by centuries. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel grow and lets me keep making these deep dives into the stories that shaped our world. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Should the West have done more to save Constantinople? And could the Byzantine Empire, given a little more time, have survived? I will see you in the next one.